Warm applause for Ben. Does the clicker work? It does. Hi, my name is Ben. This is the year of RPKI on the control plane. It's a joke because anyone who says it's the year of anything is probably wrong. See Linux. Codename, good intern project 2020. It's a nice small project, potentially, depending how big your network is. So I did this talk last year, so previously on RPKI, in case you haven't seen that talk, was roughly, I gave four major points. One is obviously sign your prefixes. That's really easy, especially if you're in RIPE, because it's just a simple case of going to the control panel, if you're the lit at least. Most important point is validate your inbound prefixes, because not many people actually do that, as we found out. Also, the second important point was to actually configure your RPKI validator correctly, because of interesting contract politics with Aaron. We've learned some new things between then and now. So this is what the RPKI signing pie chart looked like last year. And I pointed out that the invalid section of that actually was pretty big. And depending on your situation, you might not want to potentially drop that much traffic or that many prefixes. This year, we actually have hard numbers to say that it does not matter. And it does not matter thanks to Job, Job and I assume the person who potentially produced this graph, pointed out that the traffic that goes to these prefixes, these invalid prefixes, is almost nothing and is, in most cases, not really worth worrying about, especially because the traffic going to these prefixes might actually be legitimate heat hijacks that you should probably stop. So this is what the pie chart looks today. We're moving up from, we've almost doubled the pie chart screen size. The invalid part has stayed roughly the same, it's only moved by 0.2%. The interesting way to look at it on top is that if there's a second, so if no one has ever seen these pie charts before, NIST has an RPKI monitor, as it says at the bottom. They have a second viewing, which I overlooked, but is actually way more useful. This is the same pie chart, but divided into /24s. So we can say that 17.28% of all /24s on the internet, or worth of 24 space on the internet, is actually valid, and only 0.27 is invalid. At this point, I would really argue if it's worth worrying at all about the 0.27%. Maybe it does matter if you're a large transit carrier, but I would say for the end network, it's really not worth thinking too much about. And you just deal with the customer complaints as they go along. So yeah, I wouldn't don't lose sleep on the 0.27%. Personally, that's my own advice. The second thing, while presenting this at another place, was that RPKI is not very good because it has no path validation. And this is a separate thing. It's actually a pretty valid criticism. To understand why this is a problem, I can briefly explain in the infamous wavy diagram. So you have a few networks in the middle. You're roughly trusting those two routes in the middle to be vaguely competent, except with RPKI, you don't actually have to. So you can say that, assuming there are signatures with those resources in AS99, you can say that they are valid. And the way it works is the same sort of technology that validates your same certificate chains, the same sort of thing that your browser uses, which is nice. And very complicated if you try and implement it yourself. What this prevents, though, is, say, a AS45. It's worth pointing out I'm picking AS numbers from the air. If anyone is AS45, I apologize. But assuming AS45 decides to be evil and picks up your addresses, it will block because it's not signed to use that address. But one thing that AS45 can do is just pretend to downstream you. And this actually does validate because RPKI has no path validation. The thing to also realize when people make these arguments is that a lot of route selection policies are still very dependent on, if I can stop working, there we go, are still very dependent on the AS path. And so even if AS45 is to be evil and you are announcing at the same time, then mostly speaking, you will probably win purely on the shortness of your path. Incidentally, of course, this may get more hairy if people are hijacking you over IXPs, but this is also why IXPs should be deploying RPKI validation on their root servers. But that's another separate topic. The better way I can describe to people these days on RPK deployment is don't think of RPKI as a step, like a huge overhaul. Think of it as a non-crappy IIR database. Because IIR databases are, while a fundamental point of filtering, and filtering is very important, some of them are not authenticated, and you can put whatever you want, potentially, in my opinion, even more dodgily in exchange for money. Just pay a subscription to a company and you get to put stuff in unauthenticated into IR databases that people trust. Just seems a bit sketchy to me. And as a side effect, of course, you get like loads of random crap in. This is just an example in AS sets. Most of this stuff I never got asked to be added into, but you can easily see that like just over time you just accumulate stuff in AS sets. If you're curious, this is a tool called IR Exporter made by NLNOG. It's super handy if you want to go and check out who thinks they should be upstreaming you. So yeah, roughly speaking, RPKI, definitely prefer RPKI over IR databases, but still, if it's your last option, please do some filtering. So, it's 2019, and my clicker doesn't work. I'm just going to move it forward manually now. It's 2019. How's adoption? So we looked at this graph previously, and we say that 15.8-ish% of people now are now signing their prefixes, or have filed to do so. We're going to run on assumptions that two things have happened. Lots of people have default routes in their network, which means that even if they drop a route from coming in, packets will still be able to return back over the default route. And the other more sadder fact is a lot of people are signing routes but not installing the stuff in their network to validate them, and not dropping invalid routes. To test this, we need to have 3 prefixes. What we have is 2 invalid prefixes, one from ARIN and one from RIPE, and we have a control prefix which is signed correctly. And we use a lovely piece of software called the ICMP 9000, which sole's purpose is to shoot packets into the internet, sort of just collect what falls off into a bucket, which then feeds the other ICMP 9000s that specifically only use the invalid, valid, and write invalids and the ARIN valid. What comes out is basically giant bitmap files, which just contain latency information, and eventually there's another program that crunches this into CSVs. And then I spend many nights staring at spreadsheets, trying to see if anything is actually improving. So, are things actually improving? Here's what I'm going to briefly explain what my diagrams mean. So, we have 3 buckets, 3 giant bitmap files. If people are only in the ARIN green bucket, that's great. That means that we've sent them packets, but when we tried to send them packets on the invalids, we didn't get a response back. This means they're validating, and this means they're dropping invalid routes, and they don't have a default route to circumvent it. If you see a response on the ARIN invalid bucket only, then they are using popular ROA validator setups, but only with defaults. And we'll get on to what the default means later, and why it means that ARIN isn't included. And obviously, the vast majority of the internet still falls into all 3 buckets in where they're not validating everything. If you see an IP address in all buckets, they just return packets, or they have a default route. So I said something earlier about why ROAs are not all equal. This is, as I said last year, ARIN has a license on downloading the root CA of ARIN, and a lot of people don't like that agreement because it's a bit weird, and it includes a bunch of legalese that I don't understand, so I won't make a huge amount of commentary on the legal agreement. I just know that a lot of people will refuse to agree with something, or it requires the company to widely agree with it, which means it's a non-starter for a network engineer sometimes. So that's unfortunate. This does have a similar impact as it had the previous years, so here are the bucket counts. For some reason, my testing methodology has decided to double numbers this year. I don't know why. I spent a lot of time in trying to figure out why. I don't know why. So we'll just assume that the internet has grown a lot in terms of active hosts. But the funny thing is, the ratio is the same. the numbers have gone up quite significantly. The interesting part is the gap between ARIN and RIPE has roughly stayed similar. It's widened in terms of the number of hosts that have the problem, and that is the problem being that the upstream ISP is not including the ARIN TAL invalidation, so ARIN invalids are not detected as invalid. So yeah, hosts are generally growing, which is great. This also shows that a lot more people are deploying RPKI, which is great. Things that we can't test in this methodology, though, is things like CGNAT, which is becoming ever popular. I noticed the other day on a train that actually my cell phone provider is now dropping RPKI invalids, one of the biggest cell phone carriers in the UK, which is surprising because I had nothing about it. I just think they silently did it, or maybe they're about to announce it. Who knows? So in total, we now have 616 RPKI filtering ASNs, which is a massive improvement from 50 last year. Last year, I said that the entire IP space amounted to something around a /15. This year, it amounts to 6/8s, which is a sizable portion of the internet now. Apparently last year it was 2 11s. Run myself over my own slides. And the growth on this has almost entirely been due to the fact that Tier 1 and Tier 2 providers are now doing RPKI filtering. AT&T was a massive one. CCOM and Work Online have both done a huge amount of work in the African market to deploy RPKI, and university networks are now doing it. SurfNet, which provides a lot of the downstreams for universities, and Merit, which appears to do a lot of downstream networks for the US universities, is now doing it. In fact, I managed to trace a decent amount of the population, the benefit, down to AT&T itself. The others are the ones that are probably easily citable, but I didn't have enough time to go and analyze the full chain of dependencies, or up and downstreams. I just realized this graph is slightly unfortunate in that it's implying that SurfNet is a huge amount of it. That's unfortunately AT&T. So, obviously though, this is not very useful information. We need graphs for decision makers. So bear with me. There's going to be some interesting graphs now using prediction. Assuming the same growth rate, we can assume that we will eventually, by 2021, have more ASNs doing RPKI than there are ASNs. So I should say that, assuming the same growth rate, we're sorted. Just keep doing what you're doing. We'll be fine. Perfect. Rather than here's what it looked like. Here's what the population looked like in terms of countries in 2018. Noted that it was mostly Dutch. Who'd have thought? Actually, this year it's been completely overtaken by the US. And the reason being is, once again, AT&T provide a huge amount of downstreams to single-homed networks, which massively biases these numbers. But it's really cool. I think Tier 1, Tier 2 RPI filtering is really useful, and that some hospital that runs their own ASN is very unlikely to deploy RPKI, but if their middle stream providers do, brilliant. If it makes things safer, it's worth doing. That being said, while your upstream provider might be doing it, you still need to do it if you peer, or have PNI links anyone could announce anything to you and you would accept it regardless. And with that, I have shout-outs to do. Thanks to Job for lending me a server with a lot of bandwidth and prefixes. And also thanks to NTT Communications for helping with prefixes and signing them invalid on purpose. So yeah, I will now take questions. And if you're interested in the raw data, there is a QR code here so you can stare at the spreadsheets that I've been staring at for the last few weeks.
Hello? Yes. So, if we can sell a fake thing like RPKI to the general population, we should focus on multi-level marketing next.
Routing pyramid schemes? Oh, that's spanning tree.
Marcus AS286, just to comment on AT&T, they only filter on peers, not on downstreams. So that's something you have to consider. Another thing to remark now is Telia is starting to roll out. That's quite good, I think, as well. So.
Sorry, what was the last thing you said?
Telia 1299 is rolling
cool.
out RPKI, expected end of October, I think it was.
They are starting
Starting.
in October.
Yeah.
So they announced that starting in October they're deploying origin validation on more and more eBHP sessions. So I think they'll beat NTT to the punch.
On track for 2021, more ASs deploying RPKI
Right,
than
and we
ASs.
only need 2 data points to extrapolate a curve.
Just multiply every number by 10, it's fine.
Question for you, Marcus. Is KPN done with... Nice.
How's NTT doing with their RPKI?
We are using it.
It depends.
It depends.
It depends.
I have received news that we should really start looking into testing the software to deploy it, because our customers are asking for it, and the commercial pressure is insurmountable, and Trump's technical advice. Okay. So yeah, 2020, I hope.
2021. That's when we'll hit the more ASNs than...
I'm kind of hoping NTT will be there in 2020. We'll be like the elbow. Yeah. Any final questions for Ben? This is your chance.
Hi. I actually have a question about, you mentioned the example of, some network saying, okay, fine, here's a route with a valid signature, but it can be routed for us, but actually, that's not entirely a good idea. Does that mean that China, for example, can say, okay, fine, here's some American whatever block, go and route it for us, and that will still work without the what do you call it, the validation, the path validation?
I don't fully understand your question. Are you saying that... Yeah, sorry, could you summarize your question?
Yeah, there was an example used of like an evil network that would say, fine, just route for us, because you validate the signature according to the actual route that was given from the origin, and that signature is valid, but it's coming from some evil network.
Oh, so yes, no, this means, you mean, we'll get there eventually. Too many slides. Why did I put this at the beginning?
Yes, the path validation.
Yeah, path validation, so where you can do this.
Yes, exactly. And so that means that China can still say, okay, well, route data that's supposed to go to Google for us, for example.
Yeah, that could totally happen. RPKI would not prevent that. What would prevent that is obviously things like, ironically, AS like set filtering might prevent that, in knowing like which ASs are in downstream that you expect from appearing. We saw this exactly from Google, when Google got hijacked from a leak in Nigeria. Was it China Telecom that picked up the leak or something? And this is like, yeah, this can easily happen. It's unfortunate. It doesn't help leaks.
A good thing to keep in mind, if you look at pure route leaks, so you're not altering any of the attributes, you just take in information, pass it on to the wrong neighbor. Those have negative consequences, but they're not that big, because generally people route according to shortest AS path. A leak, by definition, will be a longer AS path because the leaking entity is in the middle. So it can be annoying. You may even use the path that is leaked, but the path that is being leaked will by definition have a data plane path to the actual destination. So with a pure leak, you're probably ignoring it if you're well peered, and even if you do use the leak, the worst thing is congestion. And then compared to the BHP optimizer case, there is no congested path back. There's simply no path back whatsoever. So leaks in and of itself, the risk is not as high as other like BHP optimizers. And we should always keep in mind, an attacker, when they spoof the origin, by definition, they make the AS path one hop longer, because you cannot fumble the spoofed ASN as if it's the direct neighbor of the network you're trying to influence. So attackers are at a disadvantage. Yes, you can spoof, but it comes at a cost, and direct peering helps mitigate some of that.
Although to add on to that, counterpoint on that. A lot of networks will prefer their own customers, so if you are very tactical with your upstream choices as an attacker, you could easily, say if I don't have level 3, you could very easily attack my network by just announcing my network as a leak on level 3. So you have to combat that as well. Yeah. Basically, countries could easily hijack. I mean, not even countries, like anyone. Anyone with unfiltered sessions, this is still a problem. Like path validation is an unsolved problem. BGPsec didn't really get that far, I think, in terms of deployment.
From printer to shredder?
I mean, maybe, yeah, printer to shredder, maybe. Oh, okay.
If you don't enforce first AS, say for instance if you have a peer in a peer group with a root server at a typical IX, then an adversary who has control of the route that you're peering with could potentially inject a route with the origin of the desired victim as the first AS in the path.
There are many ways to get around this. The point is, though, is that, once again, this is more about replacing IRR databases in a very secure fashion rather than fixing every single problem. If you try and fix every single problem, you have IPv6. And
we can go home now. Is there anything Ben should do for next year?
I actually was attempting to see if I could run the same experiment on IPv6. I think I can, but it's going to be very sketchy, fluffy numbers. But you can get a decent idea of which ASs have got path validation on v6. And there are some gaps between those who deploy on v4 and those who deploy on v6.
Yeah. Okay, that's your
homework.
homework.
More next year if I'm invited.
Yep. Ben, thank you for your presentation and updates. Much appreciated.